Choosing sides, the U.S. inches closer to moving its Israeli embassy to Jerusalem. Will it shatter prospects for peace? Also on today's program, West Africa's win. Regional leaders prevent chaos in the Gambia after Jammeh flees the country. We speak with the nation's former Secretary General. I'm Imran Garda, and this is the Newsmakers. It's a gamble that could unleash dangerous consequences. Donald Trump's U.S. administration says it's in the early planning stages of moving the U.S. embassy in Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, upending 7 decades of international consensus. Now, the action would amount to the U.S. recognizing the contested city as Israel's capital. Jerusalem is considered one of the world's holiest sites for both Muslims and Jews. Israel calls Jerusalem its eternal and undivided capital. But the UN has emphasized neutrality and says Israel's claim is a violation of international law because they illegally seized the eastern half of the city. Palestinians consider occupied East Jerusalem as the likely capital of their future state. Today's newsmaker is Jerusalem, as we ask what impact the embassy move could have on any hopes for peace.
We will move the American embassy to the eternal capital of the Jewish people, Jerusalem.
A campaign promise, now a potential reality, one which could reignite tensions, constantly at a tipping point.
إن مثل هذا الإجراء لو اتخذ نقول إنه سيدمر عملية السلام.
Relocating the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem would signify a recognition of the contested Holy City as Israel's capital, defying the wishes of Palestinians who want the occupied eastern part of the city as the capital of a future Palestinian state. The move would also be a departure from decades of U.S. policy and may jeopardize any hope for peace.
We've believed, consistent with the position that had been taken with previous U.S. administrations for decades now, that it was important for us to send a signal, a wake-up call, that this moment may be passing.
Many Israelis have welcomed Donald Trump's victory with open arms. After what's been called a grudge match between former U.S. President Barack Obama and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It hit its peak when the Obama administration abstained on a vote at the UN last month, which called Israel's settlement activity illegal, something long established under international law. Trump, like many of his fellow Republicans, condemned Obama for not having struck down the vote with a veto, as is customary.
I am stunned at what happened last month. This government, our government, abandoned our ally Israel when she needed us the most.
It appears that with Trump now in power, Israel feels emboldened to increase its illegal settlement activity. Just 2 days after the U.S. inauguration, Israel approved building permits for nearly 600 homes in settlements in East Jerusalem.
Will the United States Embassy be in Jerusalem?
Well, I think I've answered it twice now. We are at the early stages in this decision-making process.
And while the Trump administration appears to be taking its time with a city that lies on the fault line of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it seems America's so-called unshakable support for Israel is only hardening. A message Donald Trump is expected to deliver in person when he hosts Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu next month, one of the first foreign leaders invited to Trump's White House. Randolph Nogle, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Liz Burney from New York. She's the Director of Special Projects for the Zionist Organization of America. That's the oldest pro-Israel organization in the United States. And from Washington, D.C., Kristen Zaremski. She's the Media and Communications Director for American Muslims for Palestine, a national education and advocacy organization. Thanks, both of you, for joining us. Liz Burney, let me start with you. Isn't this a provocation, possibly moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem? It's inviting trouble, isn't it?
I don't think so. I think that the provocation is to say that following U.S. law, It's been U.S. law since 1995 that the embassy must be moved to Jerusalem. Repeated presidents have promised presidential candidates have promised to move the embassy to Jerusalem. The Jerusalem Embassy Act of 1995 was passed overwhelmingly by both parties. It's bilaterally, 93-5 in the Senate, also 90% of the House. This is the will of the American people. And the problem is, you cannot not move the embassy and not follow American law and not keep presidential candidates' promises because of threats of terrorism.
Okay, there's American law. There's also UN Security Council Resolution 478 after the annexation of Jerusalem. The UN Security Council was clear; it doesn't recognize.
Well, I won't call it an annexation. It's not an.
I'm calling it what the UN Security
because this is territory.
Sure, but I'm calling it what the UN Security Council calls it.
But it's
These
not
are not my words.
But it's not accurate.
Okay.
It's not
You might disagree with the UN Security Council. If you'd allow me to finish my question, ma'am, if you don't mind, please.
The mandate for Palestine in 19.
May I please finish my question?
Okay, sure.
So the UN Security Council in 1980 said, hey, we don't recognize this. The US abstained back then. So the entire international community says, hey, you might consider this your capital, but it's not. Does that not mean anything?
It's legally the capital of Israel. The Washington D.C. became the capital of the United States because Congress passed a law. The Israeli Knesset passed a law that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. It's also been the capital of Israel for over 3,000 years,
sure.
Which the Jerusalem Embassy Act, passed by the U.S. Congress, recognizes. It also, the Jerusalem Embassy Act also recognizes that in addition to being the capital of Israel legally and for over 3,000 years. It has also been the capital, de facto capital, where the Knesset is there.
Although crucially, I mean, you say the United States chose Washington D.C. as its capital. The entire international community recognizes Washington D.C. as the capital of the United States. Not so the case.
It's not up to what the international. It's not up to what the international community recognizes, and international law recognizes it. The applicable international law is in the 1922 Mandate for Palestine, which was held in trust for the Jewish people, and that area included Jerusalem. It included the area of Israel within the armistice lines. It included all of Judea and Samaria.
That's
and
1922.
It also included Jordan.
Okay, ma'am. That's 1922. We could argue that it's superseded by.
That's the only applicable binding international law.
That's 1922.
UN resolutions are not binding international law. UN resolutions do not make international law. The UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council cannot make or interpret international law.
Okay, so just before I go to the other guest,
if I could jump in here for a moment,
ma'am, just before I go to the other guest, we could argue that 1948, 1967, 1980, and so on and so forth would supersede 1922. Nevertheless, let me go to Kristen. Kristen, do you believe it's a provocation, or, as Liz said, this was passed in Congress, it's American law, that should be the case, that the U.S. Embassy should be in Jerusalem as the American people want?
Well, look, you can shout as loudly as you want about the mandate of Palestine, but that completely ignores the fact that the entire global community rejects the idea that Jerusalem is the undivided capital of Israel. You have resolution, as you mentioned, 478, which says Israel's declaration of Jerusalem as its capital as null and void. You know, you have UN Resolution 242, which talked about the prohibition of acquiring land through war, settling the refugee issue, and also having the Israeli military remove itself from 1967 lines. Now we have UN resolution.
Excuse me, you're wrong about resolution. I have to correct that.
The new one in the United Nations. Let me finish my point, please, because I was quiet for you.
Resolution 242
no, I am going to finish my point, and my point is that the United Nations Security Council has said there's no legal validity to the settlements whatsoever.
Okay, Kristen, finish your point, and then
there's no legal validity to the settlements whatsoever, and also that the global community is not recognizing anything in Jerusalem beyond the 1967 lines except for what both parties have agreed to in negotiations. So therefore, the annexations and the settlements and moving settlers into East Jerusalem, revoking Palestinian residency permits in East Jerusalem, all of this is completely not accepted by the global community.
Okay, let's get a response
yes,
from
we
Liz
do
then.
have a law.
Okay, Liz?
Okay. First of all, she's misstating what Resolution 242 states, and she's misstating the entire history. Jerusalem was Jewish-owned, and where Jews lived for thousands of years. In 1948, Jordan illegally invaded Israel, illegally occupied the eastern portion of Jerusalem, and expelled the Jews who were living there for centuries, and destroyed 58, just blew up 58 Jewish synagogues that had been there for centuries. So what she's saying, that when the Jordanian occupation ended, because of another war of aggression by Jordan, Jordan attacked Israel again, and Israel won back the eastern portion of Jerusalem. What she's saying is that you have to depopulate all of that, because Jordan illegally occupied the eastern portion of Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria for 19 years, despite all the centuries that the Jews have been living there, and despite the mandate which lawfully gave these areas to Israel, an internationally recognized binding agreement.
Again, Liz, you're citing the mandate. You're citing UN mandates from 1922, but you won't recognize UN mandates from now and from.
But that is the
far more
operative
recent.
law. That is the
1922
operative law.
How does
Nothing
1922
she's cited,
trump
it has not
what's recent?
changed. That.
You can't
Imran,
use
I
the,
also
you,
need to jump in
you
here
can't
because
use,
we
you
need
can't
to
use the UN.
What's recent is
to
not
situate
international
your
law.
arguments.
The
Okay.
UN Security Council, you have international law is a treaty.
Okay.
Nothing that has happened since then is a binding treaty.
Okay, Kristen, I'm going to come to you in a minute, but Liz,
I also
Liz, allow
want
me
to-
to ask
If
you.
the UN,
I want to
Kristen,
refute
I'm
the
going to
Zionist
come to you
narrative
in a
about-
moment, Kristen. I'm going to come to you in a moment. Liz, let me ask you, do you believe in a two-state solution, Liz?
Do I believe in a two-state solution? I believe that, okay, first of all, that's a misnomer, because there already is a state, which is the state of Israel, which is legally entitled to the entire area. Now, if you're asking me if I'm for the creation of a Palestinian state, I am not, because it would be a terrorist state. We know the surveys show that Hamas would win.
That's
There's
fine. So you
also
don't.
ISIS there.
Okay,
ISIS,
so you don't.
The recent terrorist attack
Liz, allow me to bring Kristen in.
committed by an ISIS. PFLP, which is a designation.
Liz, I asked you if you believe in a two-state solution. You said no. So allow me to bring Kristen in now. So Kristen, I'm looking at some of the responses. Okay, Liz, you made your point. You don't believe in a two-state solution. I thought you did. Kristen, looking at some of the reactions to the potential of the U.S. Embassy moving to Jerusalem, we've had from Fatah Central Committee, Jibril Rajoub, saying, in our opinion, moving the embassy to Jerusalem is a declaration of war against Muslims. Isn't that really reckless and maybe unwise from him to try and perhaps blow that out of proportion and to whip people up into a frenzy? Do you agree that maybe he shouldn't have said that?
Well, before I even answer that question, I really want to jump in here and refute the Zionist narrative that Liz keeps forwarding, that Jews have owned basically Jerusalem for 3,000 years. You know, the Arabs there were indigenous Jews living in that area, of course. There are also indigenous Arabs. It's been a Muslim land since the 7th century, except for a 90-year period during the Crusades. Jerusalem is very important, not just to Jewish people, but to Muslims and Christians as well. When Palestine was partitioned by the United Nations in 1947. Jerusalem was set aside as a corpus separatum, and it was supposed to be administered by an international city administered by a UN trusteeship council. And it's supposed to be
and the Arabs
part
refused
of the
to
final
accept that,
status
so that never
negotiations.
became that
Liz,
never
let me
became an
finish,
operative
please.
agreement.
And then, yes, we have a law in the United States to move the embassy, but no president has Every single president since that law was passed in 1995 has signed the waiver, which is included in the law, because even Congress understood that moving the embassy will inflame tensions not just in Palestine, but throughout the Middle East and the Arab and Muslim world.
Okay, so
Every
Kristen,
single
again,
president has
to
signed
answer
the
my
waiver
question,
since
so
1995.
Kristen, sorry, because we are running out of time. Do you believe or do you accept that some politicians, like this Fatah member that I quoted, are inflaming tensions by already calling it an attack, a declaration of war against the Muslim world?
Well, I'm not going to speak directly to what the PA says, but I am going to say, why do the Palestinians always have to be told how they need to react? If you move the embassy, if we move the embassy to Jerusalem, we're telling the Palestinians that we absolutely are shutting the door on their self-determination. We're telling the Palestinians that we accept Israeli occupation of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. So
it's not occupation.
There
it's not occupation.
will no longer be a path to peace if we move the embassy.
Liz, it's an occupation according to
I just want to ask.
It's not going to affect any path to peace.
Okay.
And
Liz, again, you cited international law for Israel's
even
claim,
for those, even if
but it's an
there are
occupation according to international law. Can we at least agree on the military occupation of the West Bank?
It's not an occupation. No, it's not an occupation according to international law. It's not an occupation according to international law because Israel has the sovereign right to this area, which was granted in 1922 in the Mandate for Palestine, and that has none of the other resolutions have had the ability to change it because it would require a treaty. And in fact, in the Jordanian-Israeli treaty in 1994, it says that the border, the Jordanian-Israeli border, is the Jordan River.
Okay, I have a final question for Kristen.
Well, the mandate actually ended.
Kristen,
Liz, you need to stop living in 1922. The mandate ended.
Sure, Kristen, I have a final question for you.
The UN Resolution 80 says that the mandate, that the rights that were given under the mandate continue.
Okay, this is terribly
That's
frustrating.
Not true.
Kristen, final question for you because I'm out of time.
You're wrong.
Sorry,
also, you're wrong about saying that.
Okay, Liz, we're all wrong. Kristen, final question for you. Do you think it's going to happen?
Do I think no, reports indicate that the Trump administration may be walking back his pledge to move the embassy. There have been conflicting messages, but there was a new report coming out today saying that the administration, like Sean Spicer, would not even confirm that it would be moved by the end of Trump's first term. So I think that perhaps there are cooler heads prevailing. I know, Trump is pretty bombastic, but he has shown that he does listen to advisors from time to time. It may be that he is hearing from, the international community. France and the Paris summit that just happened recently, and other countries are saying this will be extremely detrimental. It will inflame tensions in the entire region if you do this. There are people within Congress saying this is not in America's national interest, and that's what that waiver is for, to protect our national security. And so I do believe that there's a possibility that he may take the routes of previous presidents before him and sign the waiver when it ends at the end of May.
Okay, Liz and Kristen, I wish and I hope we could have got through much more.
Actually, there are people in Congress who are pushing to get rid of the waiver. There's an act that has bipartisan support to get rid of the waiver. In fact, Congress is pushing to move and the Republican platform of 2016 supports moving the embassy to Jerusalem, and it has overwhelming.
And let's see if that waiver does come into effect. Liz and Kristen, I've got to wrap. I'm sorry.
It's in the U.S. national security interest to have peace in the Middle East.
Bye-bye. Thank you. While the world's attention was fixed on Washington, D.C. as Trump took power, another historic change of leadership was taking place in West Africa. Property developer Adama Barrow was sworn in as president of the Gambia, while the incumbent refused to step down. It was a tragically familiar scene. A leader who'd seized power in a coup, ruled for decades, then lost an election but wouldn't hand over the reins. There were fears the country was on the brink of civil war. But just as West Africa's military might was poised to remove him by force, President Yahya Jammeh fled the country. It's being seen as a win for democracy in the Gambia and a sign of success in West African cooperation.
An historic moment in the Gambia. After 22 years in power, Yahya Jammeh has stepped down. and Adama Barrow has taken oath as the new president. Many people here believe Barrow will change politics as usual. But officials say Jammeh carried out one final act before he left the country, emptying the state funds.
Within the period of 2 weeks alone, nearly $500 million were withdrawn by the former president. That's a lot of money.
Luxury cars and other items were also reportedly loaded onto a cargo plane from Chad. Jammeh, who is now in exile in Equatorial Guinea, has not commented on the allegations. But by avoiding a major conflict in the nation, by finally stepping aside, the alleged loss of state cash may be a small price to pay for regional stability. The Gambia is one of Africa's smallest countries. Situated along the continent's western coast, unlike many of its neighbors, it has enjoyed long-term political stability. But when Yahya Jammeh was defeated in 2016's shock election by opposition candidate Adama Barrow, a political crisis ensued. Jammeh initially conceded defeat, congratulating Barrow for his clear victory. Many political prisoners were freed from jail in the following days, but after the official results came out, Jammeh changed his mind, saying he will not step down, citing abnormalities. Regional governments, the US and the UN, pressured him to accept the result. The crisis dragged on to 2017, and the Gambia's army chief reaffirmed his loyalty to Jammeh. Tensions rose in the country, and thousands began fleeing to neighboring Senegal. Shortly after, Jammeh declared a state of emergency, blaming foreign powers for the crisis. 2 days later, Barrow was sworn in as president at the Gambian embassy in Senegal, and UN-backed regional forces gave Jammeh a deadline to step down before they intervene. He took them up on the ultimatum the next day, before any altercation began. Barrow is now still in Senegal, but says he is ready to set foot on his nation's soil within the next few days, a nation that he says has now become a democracy. Donald Cameron, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now is the Honourable Abdul Sarah Janha from London. He's the former Secretary General and head of the Gambia Civil Service. Thanks so much for joining us, sir. So, not a shot fired, and we had a peaceful resolution in the end when many feared that this was going to be civil war because Jammeh didn't want to go. He's gone now. Has the Gambia bucked the trend on the continent? Is this great news?
Oh, very great news, of course, that we were able to sort this out without any fatality and no form of violence. I think it's great, and it's great for the West African region in particular.
Did the reality really, dawn on Jammeh, and did the penny drop for him when he realized, I might not get away with this?
I think the reality dawned on him that really he cannot get away with it because the 7,000 troops were determined to get Barrow inaugurated as president of the Gambia. And Jammeh was not quite sure whether he would get the full support of the Gambian army itself. That's why at the end of the day, he called Alpha Condé, president of Guinea, and the president of Mauritania to intervene at the last minute because ECOWAS were poised to move in and get him out by force. Luckily, this was averted.
There are those who want him prosecuted. There are people talking about the ICC. There are people saying that he needs to be held accountable in some way, shape, or form. He also didn't leave with empty pockets. There's about $11 million missing. With all of that in mind, should he be held to account, or should we be looking at the big picture and say, hey, he's gone at least, and Barrow now is the democratically elected leader. Going after Jammeh would be counterproductive. What do you think?
My view is we should follow what the President Barrow said, that we're going to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and proper investigation will be done. And if he is found guilty of any of the crimes that have been indicated, torture, the murder of people, innocent people, the confiscation of property that belongs to the private citizen without due recourse to the courts, and his total neglect of the rule of law, then really the dice will be cast and we will seek for his extradition and prosecution.
Final question for you, sir. How difficult is it going to be for Barrow to unite the country, given that there were many citizens of the Gambia and many members of the military, key members of the military and others who had supported Jammeh staying? So how hard is it going to be to unite the country for Barrow?
It's not going to be that difficult, because really people were living under a very serious fascist form of government. Even those who were supporting Jammeh were doing it because of fear, out of fear. And one community in general, in particular, the community where he comes from, the ethnic group where he comes from, feels also as persecuted by Jammeh. They couldn't react because the guy had the military under his thumb. He has the notorious National Intelligence Service, which was used to torture Gambians to put them in line. And it's almost equivalent to the Tantam Makud of Haiti, very notorious in every sense of the word. So right now, Barrow is riding on a wave of high expectation and huge support from the Gambian public. So if he moves in positively and keep that spirit on, I think he will be able to unite the country for the transition period of 3 years.
I've got to wrap. Unfortunately, the show's ending, but it's been a pleasure, Abdusara Janha. Thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.